Nintendo has a history of making some fairly oddball stuff, so it's tempting to write off any obscure accessory as some crazy Nintendo experiment, but that's often not exactly the case. This is the Bayer Didget blood glucose monitoring system for Nintendo DS, and believe it or not, Nintendo initially had no interest in allowing this thing to exist. But before I go into its history, let's talk about what exactly this thing is. The first original version of this product was called the Gluco Boy, a product developed by Guidance Interactive and released in Australia only. It aimed to increase blood glucose testing compliance among children with diabetes by making the testing more approachable and rewarding them with video games. The Gluco Boy is a state-of-the-art blood glucose monitor that doubles as a Game Boy Advance cartridge. It includes a handful of games built into the unit, each of which reward you in-game for testing your blood glucose levels. It's more complex than that, though. Its inventor, Paul Wessel, wrote what he describes as a 4-page algorithm to determine what kinds of rewards you'll get, factoring a ton of variables in, such as time of day tested, consistency over time, and of course what your actual blood glucose levels are. Its patented closed-circuit technology ensures that the device is completely error-proof, which was really important in getting Nintendo on board with the product. So let's talk a little about the games. Gluco Boy includes 2 big titles, Lost Star Saga and Knock 'em Downs. You access these in the mini-games from the hub world of your bedroom. Lost Star Saga is a traditional turn-based RPG with a linear storyline following either Coda or Janet in their search for their missing crewmate. You and your party fight aliens, mutants, and sometimes bears with power-ups and items unlocked through the player testing their blood sugar. While the story and the dialogue are relatively simple and maybe lacking finesse, the art is genuinely good, and the battle system is solid. This is no shovelware. Lost Star Saga is actually a pretty cool game. Knock 'em Downs follows the adventures of a player who has worked at a Knock 'em Downs style carnival booth all summer, only to find that the pins have come to life and escaped. It's an action RPG with various arena-style mini-bosses to fight and various quests to do. The weapons are whimsical things like teddy bear guns, and the enemies give off a very Earthbound vibe as you fight off lawn flamingos, clowns, and fire hydrants. It's an enjoyable game. And of course, like Lost Star Saga, items and power-ups are unlocked by using the Gluco Boy to test the player's blood sugar. Additionally, 3 mini-games are unlockable using points earned through consistent testing. Solar Wing, the side-scrolling shoot-'em-up, Plexus, an Earth defense game that plays similarly to Breakout, and my personal favorite, Raccoon Rancher, a game in which you control a fence to wrangle and sort raccoons into color-coded areas. Fun side note, Raccoon Rancher originally had this audio clip play upon clearing each stage. Sensory Sweep founder and CEO Dave Rushton apparently assumed it was an inside joke he didn't understand, so it was changed to the much more tame... The Gluco Boy also had its own online community for kids where they could register their devices and create their own webpage profiles. Kind of like a kid-friendly MySpace. Gluco's reward points, or grip points, could be spent online after registering. Their site suggested plans for Gluco Boy apparel, a card game, and custom skins and cases, although this never came to fruition. A revised edition of Gluco Boy, this time for the Nintendo DS, happened after healthcare giant Bayer bought Guidance Interactive in 2008. It was released as the Didget blood glucose monitoring system for Nintendo DS, given a sleek redesign and different game software. This time the game was on a Nintendo DS cartridge, separate from the blood glucose monitor, and the monitor itself would plug into the Game Boy Advance port of a Nintendo DS or DS Lite. Contrary to what most media outlets reported at the time, it could also be hooked up to a DSi, which lacks the GBA port, via Wi-Fi connection. The game cartridge included was called Knock 'em Downs World's Fair, a continuation of one of the games included on the Gluco Boy. Another RPG-style game, you'll collect creative knocks and fight enemies. It's turn-based this time and lacks some of the fun silliness of the first Knock 'em Downs, but it's an okay enough game. Just like the Gluco Boy, testing earns points that'll allow you to get new items, customize your character, and unlock minigames. Bayer also used the Gluco Boy's online portal concept and made their own for the Didget. It's more polished, but the idea is still the same. Custom web pages made better by using reward points and chatting with other diabetic kids, etc., etc. Now let's talk about the history of this device. Paul Wessel says he's been a bit of an inventor all his life, but one idea stuck with him so much that he risked it all to make it happen. His son Luke, who had been diagnosed with type 1 diabetes, was constantly losing or hiding his blood glucose meter, but he always seemed to know exactly where his Game Boy was, even if it was hiding under the couch cushions. Wessel said, "That moment, something came to me. If I could combine blood glucose testing and video game technology, perhaps Luke would be more motivated to test." It was a thought that bounced around in his head for a long time, and eventually he quit his job to try to make it happen, founding Guidance Interactive in 2000. He had more than one project with Guidance Interactive, but all of them centered around the idea of incentive-based therapy. Wessel filed a patent for his concept June 21, 2001. He called it a handheld controller for monitoring or using medical parameters, putting together a medical testing procedure in a combination of software and hardware that provide motivation and digital rewards through a video game or handheld computing device. That's pretty broad, and for good reason. There was no guarantee he was going to be able to get Nintendo to work with him, so images found within the patent show cell phones and other electronics in addition to the Game Boy. Immediately after submitting his patent application, he filed to trademark the name Gluco Boy. Nintendo trademarked all kinds of words with the boy suffix attached, but not this one. He figured it could be used as a bargaining chip for working with them. Of course, getting in front of someone who could make the decision to work with him at Nintendo was complicated. Thankfully, a big mess of networking made it happen. Wessel played on a recreational softball team with members of Head Games publishing studio. Through his connections there, he was able to get in touch with Bruce Lowry, Nintendo of America's very first VP of sales, through the age-old business tradition of a game of golf. Lowry hadn't worked at Nintendo since the mid-'80s, but was excited about the Gluco Boy idea and connected Wessel with a bunch of his former colleagues. Wessel told me that the real product champion was Vice President Don James, another original Nintendo of America employee. Between Don James, Bruce Lowry, and licensing manager Sandy Hatcher, Wessel was finally able to make his case to the big bosses, Nintendo of Japan. Now, type 1 diabetes is pretty uncommon in Japan. Type 1 diabetes in children? Practically unheard of. So, simply put, this was just not something that anyone at Nintendo of Japan knew anything about or really cared about. Furthermore, there was an enormous liability risk associated with making a medical device. What if it gave children incorrect data and they got sick or died? Nintendo said no. Obviously, Wessel didn't give up there. Over the next couple years, he continued to correspond with people at Nintendo, educating them about the prevalence of childhood diabetes in the US, and of course going through the FDA approval process. Eventually, Nintendo caved and granted him the right to make and distribute the Gluco Boy. But there was one major problem. He didn't have the funds to make it happen. Wessel fought hard for his device. He presented to over 100 investors. He submitted his concept to every possible startup and medical project competition, and even won several awards in the process. But awards weren't paying the bills, and with no funding, he still didn't have a way to take Gluco Boy to market. He mortgaged his house several times over. He had his power shut off. He was on the brink of losing everything. Finally, in 2006, he received $1.5 million in funding from an Australian investment bank. He was able to bring in his secret weapon, Andy Swanson, a longtime Nintendo producer and manager, as vice president of Guidance Interactive. Swanson was the key to making the product effective. He took all of the complexities of Wessel's test-to-reward algorithm, boiled them down into a video game, and took it to Sensory Sweep Studios to develop it. But it was a little bit more complicated than that. Paul Wessel had promised the job to Sensory Sweep quite a while before he had the funds to hire them. When he finally had the money to develop the games, the studio was on a much shorter time frame than any of their normal development jobs. Development was rushed, tense, and Swanson even had some major disagreements with development decisions. But with so little time before Gluco Boy had to ship, his hands were pretty tied. The biggest of these disagreements was the entirety of Lost Star Saga. Swanson had designed Knock 'em Downs, but the idea and execution of Lost Star Saga was all Sensory Sweep. Swanson thought the title appealed too much to boys and wanted something a lot more neutral, but no amount of pushback worked. Sensory Sweep had no time to spare, so they were calling the shots. Brad Butler, who was the lead designer on Gluco Boy at Sensory Sweep, told me that so much had to be cut. The QA team started calling me the Axeman. He was just 21 years old and essentially lived at the office to get it finished in time. Nearly everyone who worked at Sensory Sweep touched the project in some way. It was too much work in too little time. Gluco Boy finally launched in Australia on November 14th, 2007, World Diabetes Day, partnering with Diabetes of Australia, New South Wales. It cost about $300 Australian dollars at launch, and Wessel told me that it sold 70,000 units in its year on the market. They were preparing to launch in other markets until Wessel received a phone call from German healthcare giant Bayer. In 2008, Bayer bought Guidance Interactive for more than $10 million. They also reportedly destroyed all the remaining Gluco Boys. Wessel stayed on board at Bayer for nearly a year as they tweaked the Gluco Boy to create the revised version, the Didget, for Nintendo DS. Wessel and his family were flown out to Birmingham, England for the UK launch of the product in 2009. For Wessel, after all of his sacrifice, being on stage at the product launch with his son Luke was the proudest moment of his life. In April of 2010, Didget was given FDA approval and launched in the US, with pop singer Nick Jonas as their diabetic spokesperson. It retailed for $74.99 and was sold in pharmacies across the country, making it fairly easy to find. And now it's time for some fun facts. Gluco Boy was the first consumer medical device to interface with a Nintendo Game Boy. Paul Wessel also alleges it was the first piece of consumer electronics to receive FDA approval, although I was unable to receive confirmation from the FDA. At the time of this video, there have been no documented sales of the Gluco Boy on the secondhand market, making it among the rarest peripherals in existence. In all of my research, I could only confirm 2 in the whole world. One belongs to Paul Wessel, and one is forever locked in an acrylic case somewhere at Bayer. The Didget, on the other hand, is fairly common. Paul Wessel was in his mid-30s when he went to college to get a degree in business management, graduating just a couple years before founding Guidance Interactive. He still uses his philosophy of bringing healthcare products to a target group's preferred device, with his current company, First Layer Health. I mentioned earlier that Lost Star Saga was entirely the creation of Sensory Sweep, but even that wasn't the initial game they planned to develop. Early on, Sensory Sweep had an internal competition to create a game that would use blood glucose testing incentives. The winner of this competition was called Vasco, a space exploration game where you played as a robot. The plan was to use points earned from testing to upgrade various parts on the robot. It's unclear why this was scrapped in favor of Lost Star Saga, although Andy Swanson did mention that he hated the name Vasco, as diabetes can be linked to the vascular system. And that's just about everything you'll ever need to know about both the Gluco Boy and the Didget. If you like learning about the obscure side of video game history, or video game history in general, please subscribe. Thanks for watching. I want to give an enormous shout out to both Paul Wessel and Brad Butler for helping me with this video. The gameplay you're seeing in this video is the first time Gluco Boy gameplay has been seen since the product was launched, and it's from developer builds. A legitimate Gluco Boy has yet to be found and ripped, so it's likely that some things about this gameplay you see are not final. Regardless, I would have had none of this without Brad's help, so thank you.